In our follow-up video to the first video on the scientific method, we're going to be focused on the concept of variables within scientific experiments. Now, those people that have a strong background in math will recognize the term variable from mathematics, referring to the part of an equation that undergoes change, or simply that doesn't stay the same. And that's exactly what a variable is in science. A variable refers to any factor during an experiment that specifically will change. Now, in scientific experiments, there are two different types of variables that are focused on during an experiment, what we call an independent variable, and the opposite of the word independent is the word dependent variable. Now, what is the difference between the two? Well, the simplest explanation that we give is that the independent variable is specifically the variable that we are testing to learn about in the experiment. Another way of looking at it is that the independent variables change in the experiment because we change them, or what we are doing in the experiment causes them to be different. Dependent variables do change, but we as the experimenter do not have any control over their change because dependent variables specifically respond to the changes in the independent variable. In other words, the results of the independent variable affect the dependent variable, and the relationship between how changing one changes the other is what we are looking for when we conduct scientific experiments. This is easier to understand if we look in detail at the dice experiment, because in the previous video we never actually experimentally figured out what the easiest total number to roll with two six-sided dice is, because in order to do this we would need to repeat the experiment hundreds if not thousands of times in order to get more accurate and more precise data. Fortunately, with a computer program, we can actually run this experiment 10,000 times, and if we do this, we can clearly see that 7 is the easiest total number to roll, which confirms the hypothesis that we made. Now, when we graph this data, the location of our dependent and independent variable need to be very specific. So we can see that on the horizontal, which in mathematics is what we call the x-axis, this is where the total dice roll number is. And remember, this is what we are investigating, and this is, even though the dice roll is completely random, it is our experimentation that controls what dice roll we get, meaning that dice roll number is the independent, there we go, I can spell, is the independent variable, and we can see that it's clearly placed on the horizontal x-axis. Now we can see that each of these bars in the graph are labeled with a specific number, and these numbers correspond to the vertical axis, which isn't explicitly shown here, but we know vertically on a graph is what we call the y-axis, and we can see on the y-axis we can find the total number of times in our experiment we rolled each total dice roll number. And again, the total dice roll number affects how commonly we would roll it. So this we see is our dependent variable, which is always put on the y-axis like this. The final piece of information that our graph needs in order to be complete is a graph title, which we can see here. And we can see that this graph is a graph that compares the total dice roll number on the x-axis versus the number of times we rolled each number on the y-axis. And therefore, the purpose of the graph title is to show that we compare each of the two variables. Now, for those of you that remember that I said that there are two different variables that we study in scientific experiments, I am actually going to say that I lied there, because there is a third type of variable that we call a control variable. Now, if you think about this, a control variable is technically not part of the experiment because a control variable is not supposed to vary at all. These are things that could change, but we want them not to change to stay constant. Let me give you an example. In our experiment, we specified that we are interested in looking at the results of two six-sided dice. But for anyone familiar with dice, you'll know that six-sided dice are not the only form of dice that exist. You can also have four-sided dice, which are what we call D4, eight-sided dice, which are what we call D8, and even the rare 20-sided dice, which we call D20. Now, if we did not specify six-sided dice, if we just said two dice, what if you used a D4 and a D8? Would you expect to get the same results as this graph here? Well, if you change the type of dice, that answer would obviously be no. And likewise, what if you use two D20 dice instead? Would you expect to get the same result as on our graph? Again, the answer you would expect would be no. This is why the specific type of dice, specifically using D6, is a variable that we want to keep constant so that we can focus our results on only looking at the dependent and the independent variable. So one example of a control variable that we just looked at is the type of dice. Now, another control variable that we want to control, that we want to keep constant, in this case, we said that we were going to roll the dice 10,000 times. Now, what if we only rolled the dice 100 times? Would we expect this graph to look the same? Well, obviously not, because the numbers that we have here would be impossible to get if we only rolled the dice 100 times, and therefore we wouldn't expect to get the same results. So we can also say that the number of times that we roll the dice is another variable that we want to keep constant. A third variable, we know that if you have a six-sided die, let me just do my best attempt to draw a six-sided die here, we know that there is basically an equal chance of rolling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 because the mass of the dice is balanced perfectly. But let's say you wanted to cheat at dice. Let's say that you want to force your opponent to lose by making them only roll 1. If you make the bottom of the dice heavy, we know that the heavier an object is, the more likely it is to go down because of gravity. So by adding this extra weight to the dice, and this is literally called weighted dice, we can change the results of this experiment so that only the opposite side of the heavy side lands up. And now, if we used weighted dice, would you expect to get the same result here? Obviously, the answer is no. So this is why it is important to consider as many other variables that can change your results as possible and to keep them constant or as constant as you possibly can. And as you'll learn as you study all three branches of science, this is one of the most difficult parts when it comes to designing effective experiments. This concludes our series of videos on the scientific method. To make sure that you understand this, take a look at the practice problems that follow in which different experiments are described, and from these descriptions you need to identify the independent variable, the dependent variable, and one possible control variable, and explain why this variable would change the results of your experiment and therefore needs to be kept constant.